Welcome to episode 163 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share a bit about my personal journey as a student and the struggles that I had in school. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript or to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy this episode, I'd love for you to leave a review on iTunes. This episode is sponsored in part by Teachers Learning Center, or TLC. If you need graduate level credits for license renewal or a pay step increase, check out TLC's independent study, self-paced format. TLC is accredited nationwide, and you can start anytime. Don't wait until your license is about to expire. Go to tlcgraduatecredits.com/Angela to get your coupon code now. So I could tell you the story of an anonymous child who had multiple diagnoses and was super disengaged in school, but later became a teacher and instructional coach. And then I could do a big reveal at the end. That student was me. But I will skim that drama and tell you up front because I think there's actually enough drama in the story itself. Yes, that student was me. And honestly, it's more complicated than that. I don't know necessarily that this will be a particularly inspiring or uplifting story. And it's not going to be easy for me to tell it to you either, which is why I've never done it before. I'm not proud of a lot of the things that happened and a lot of the choices that I made. And it brings up a lot of complex emotions when I think about what my experience in school was like, particularly as a teenager. I actually feel a little bit nauseous right now. I just sort of want to get this over with and questioning why I even decided to do this episode. But I'm going to talk purely just about the academics because I think that is enough of a story in itself. So here's the context. I'm turning 41 in June. So that means that I was a kid in the 80s and I graduated from high school in 1995. Like every child, the era that I grew up in had a really profound impact on the way that I was educated. I'm also an only child. It wasn't a conscious choice by my parents, but that's how life turned out for our family. And I'm also an Army brat. So we moved every 2 to 3 years when my dad would get stationed someplace new. I was a very difficult child to put into a box. And I don't know that the people who worked in my schools ever really had a chance to get to know me very well, particularly since we moved a lot. I also think that schools and parents and the world in general back then really just weren't set up to understand kids like me. A child like me today might be labeled as a highly sensitive child or an empath. Back then, I was thought of as precocious and strong-willed. My favorite question was, why? I was incredibly curious about everything, and I liked to make up my own rules. I always got the feeling that adults weren't quite sure what to make of me, honestly. A lot of them seemed flustered by my constant questions and my desire to make up my own way of doing things. The one thing that everyone did understand was that I was a good reader. I was reading at a 6th grade level in kindergarten, and I was tested and diagnosed as gifted very early on. Now, there was no gifted program in my school, and differentiation wasn't really a thing in the mid-'80s. So regardless of that diagnosis, I was still left to recite endless phonics drills with the rest of the class. My instruction really didn't change even after they had identified me as gifted. So obviously, doing phonics drills when you're reading on a 6th grade level was pretty boring for me. And since I was a creative child, I found lots of ways to make my own fun in class, most of which I think were probably pretty disruptive. Every progress report that my mom saved mentions me talking too much in class and distracting the other kids. And also, I've never been a believer in busy work, so if I already knew how to do the assignment, I just wouldn't do it. What would be the point? Sometimes I would help the kids around me instead. So I think of another way to explain things besides the way the teacher had taught it. And then I would teach it to my friends in whispers when she wasn't looking. That didn't work out very well, of course, because all of my friends would have A's on their assignments and my paper would still be blank and I'd get a 0. Other times I would create a game for myself where I would time myself to see how fast I could complete a worksheet. Accuracy did not fit into this game. I would just write something close enough to make it look like the page was complete. So that way I could read a book while the rest of the class finished. That's what I really wanted to be doing, was reading. This must have been incredibly exasperating to my teachers, who knew that I had the content mastered, and therefore they couldn't in good conscience fail me, but they also couldn't force me to actually apply myself and put any effort into the work. Let's just say I was never the teacher's pet. The most common solution back then for kids like me was to just skip a grade. So that's what happened. I went from first grade into third grade. As you can imagine, this didn't solve very many problems because I was still reading multiple grade levels above my third grade peers. So I was still bored all the time, and the problem of me talking and not doing my work didn't get any better. Now, here's a bit of a twist in the plot. Everyone was so focused on my giftedness and what a creative child I was and what a great reader I was that I think it slipped under the radar a little bit that I was by no means gifted in math. In fact, the older I got, the more I struggled. All those years of just filling out worksheets as quickly as possible meant that I wasn't actually memorizing basic addition or subtraction facts. I wasn't actually learning anything. And without that basic mathematical foundation, the more advanced concepts in upper elementary school became beyond my grasp. And it happened way more quickly than I realized. I remember sobbing at the dining room table with my dad as he drilled me on multiplication facts. He had this set of flashcards that he made himself. At that point, I was in the 6th grade, and the rest of the kids had learned the times tables years ago. It had become impossible for me to keep up with the rest of the class as we did 5-digit multiplication and division problems. My dad would sit there with me and just patiently flip through those flashcards over and over and over, and I would struggle and cry and beg to go do something else. It was torture for both of us. But if my father hadn't made me do it, I probably wouldn't know my multiplication tables today. Hate is probably not a strong enough word to describe how I felt about math when I was little. Math pained me. It just made no sense. There was one right answer to every problem, and I never knew what it was. Math required attention to detail, and one little mistake could make the entire thing wrong. But writing, that was a different story. I had written dozens of books by the time I was 7. With writing, I had the freedom to be creative, to think of new ways of doing things, to share my ideas and use words. Numbers I hated, but words I loved. Writing them, reading them, words meant possibility and imagination. And in my mind at the time, they could not have been more the opposite of math. We lived in Norway during my middle school years. Remember, my dad was in the Army. And for the first time, I was able to attend a school that had a gifted program. It was only for 6th grade. For whatever reason, in 7th and 8th grade, they didn't offer it. But I remember being pulled out for 3 hours a day, probably twice a week, maybe 3 times a week in the 6th grade. And I still remember a project we did in that class where we designed a utopian society. It was the first time I ever remember being really excited and challenged by anything in school. And that whole idea of designing a utopian society, that's something that sticks with me even today. It still inspires me. I just still have so many ideas about that sort of thing. It really planted a seed for me. When we returned to the U.S., my dad was stationed at Fort Meade, and we moved just north of Washington, D.C. At that time, I was starting high school, and my rebellious teenage years began. I was at a 2,000-student public school. It was by far the biggest I'd ever attended. And if there was ever a student who took advantage of the opportunity to be an anonymous face in a big crowded hallway, it was me. Once I realized that no one could really keep tabs on me and no one could really stop me, I skipped class constantly. And I generally put forth so little effort that My only decent grades were in the classes that I didn't really have to try in. As I'd gotten older, the rest of my peers had caught up with me in reading, of course, and so coasting by in every subject was no longer an option. The curriculum had gotten harder, and I had never learned how to work hard. I'd never learned how to persevere through things that were difficult for me. I assumed I was just bad at math and science too, for that matter, and I figured there wasn't anything I could do about it. After all, I was just good at reading and writing, and there was nothing I could do about that, right? That's the way I was. Growth mindset was not exactly a thing back then. Now, my parents were going crazy trying to figure out how their brilliant daughter was bringing home C's and D's. And then when those D's started to turn into F's, and I was failing algebra, they really didn't know what to do. When they spoke to the school counselor about it and mentioned that I had struggled with math in the past, she suggested having me tested for a disability. So it was in the 9th grade that I was diagnosed with a learning disability in math. I received accommodations in math for the first time, but I already hated math so much that it wasn't going to make much of a difference. I just wasn't interested in trying. And having that label actually made me feel like it wasn't worth the effort, since there was something just inherently wrong with my brain. In my 14-year-old mind, I now had a justification for my low grades. It was far more important to me to hang out with my friends than to catch up on math, so I just kept skipping class. And there wasn't anything the special ed teacher could do to reach me either. In the middle of my sophomore year, there were a number of personal things going on, and between that and the academic issues, my parents decided to pull me out of public school and send me to a tiny Christian school instead. My graduating class there had around 20 people in it. That's how small it was. The idea was that I wouldn't be able to get away with skipping class in such a small school, and the discipline there was much more strict. As an adult now, I recognize the incredible privilege that this was, and I'm grateful that my parents did it. But I hated it at the time, of course. Having my freedom limited made me more rebellious than I'd been before. I hated the way that girls were kept under a much closer watch than the boys. Our uniform skirt lengths were measured to ensure that no knees were showing. Our homecoming dresses had to be tried on for a panel of administrators and approved for modesty prior to the event. It wasn't even a dance. We had banquets because dancing would be inappropriate. Every day it felt like there was another rule that I had to question or a fact that I was taught and needed to push back on. The academic problems weren't solved either because this school was too small to have either a special education or gifted program for me. So even though I was legally entitled to services for both, I was back where I started, sitting in a general ed classroom, bored most of the time, and completely lost in math. Books continued to be my escape into another world, and the local library saved me from going crazy. I was still devouring a dozen or more books a week, as I'd done as a little girl. Some of it was novels, but our class had gone to Lincoln Theater in D.C. to see Lorraine Hansberry's play, A Raisin in the Sun. And it was the one academic experience of my high school career that had such a strong positive impact on me that I've never forgotten it. I began reading the poetry of Nikki Giovanni and Ntozake Shange. These women inspired me in powerful ways, and I began reading more in everything that I could about revolutionaries, particularly in the civil rights movement and in the women's rights movement. And that's basically how I survived high school. I read a lot. I hung out at the mall with my friends, and as I grew older, with my boyfriend, typical teenage stuff. I felt stuck in the quiet suburbs where there was nothing interesting to do, much less anything revolutionary or world-changing. I was basically biding my time, just doing whatever it took to slide by in my classes, and hoping that my grades in my other subjects beyond math would be high enough to allow me to get into college. Going away to college would mean freedom. Finally. I could do whatever I wanted, and I could take classes that actually interested me. and the courses that interested me would be the things that prepared me to teach. Ironically, all this time, all these bad experiences in school, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I don't really know why, given that I never enjoyed school myself. And I didn't have any lofty dreams of making school better for other kids than it had been for me. I think I just wanted to be in charge of something. I've always liked making rules and creating systems and teaching other people stuff that I know. Teaching just seemed like the natural career path for me, and I just never considered doing anything else from the time I was 5 years old. Somehow, I made it through those remaining years of high school. I really enjoyed seeing my friends, and I really enjoyed getting to assist the first grade teacher during my free period. The nice thing about going to this small private school was that it was a K-12 school, and the high school and the elementary school were all in the same building. So for an hour a day throughout my last 2 years in high school, I convinced the principal to let me go down and help the first grade teacher. I got to play school basically with real, live, actual students under the supervision of one of the most caring, wonderful teachers I've ever met. Her name was Mrs. Cernovsky. And she taught me all the insider teacher secrets, like how to put up bulletin board paper without it being a wrinkly mess. Ms. Cernovsky told me that I had the gift. I remember she wrote that in my recommendation letter. And she told me I would be an incredible teacher myself one day. My GPA averaged out over those 4 years of high school to something that was high enough for me to apply to college. It was a 3-point something, I don't remember. My first choice was a small women's college in Maryland, and I was ecstatic when they accepted me. It was called Hood College. It's named after Margaret Hood. And sadly, from my perspective at least, they had to go co-ed a number of years ago to keep enrollment numbers up. But I had the privilege of living and learning in an all-women environment for the entirety of my college education. A diverse community of young women from all over the world came there, and it was a truly special environment. I enrolled as an early childhood education major. I loved living in the dorms and having the freedom to come and go as I pleased. I loved being able to choose my courses and make my own schedule for the first time. I intentionally selected professors who didn't factor participation or attendance into their grades, so I could continue to skip class if I felt that it wasn't the best use of my time, which was pretty much daily. And the system worked for me. My days and nights were free, and I had no other obligations other than a part-time job on campus. I created my own systems for studying. And it worked, I think, because I had all the skill sets that are most valuable in college, like being a quick reader, having good comprehension skills, being a good test taker, being a strong writer. I remember spending a lot of time studying, and I didn't mind, even when I disliked the subject, because I was able to learn things my way, and I wasn't being forced to sit through boring classes. I had no trouble maintaining a 3.8 GPA in college, which came much to the relief of my parents, who had been deeply afraid that I would completely stop trying altogether once I was out from under their roof. Since it was a liberal arts school, I was required to take one math course. Thank God it was only one. I selected some sort of computer-based math course, something based on logic and if-then stuff and algorithms. But remember, this was the 90s, so it didn't involve the internet. I don't know what we were learning. It was taught by a professor who realized that he had a group of math-phobic 18-year-olds who were there to fulfill a requirement. And he treated us very kindly, very patiently, and gave me a B in the class, and I was thrilled. I started my teaching methodology courses during my sophomore year of college. Those were the only classes that I attended faithfully. I don't think I ever skipped a single one, actually. Why would I? In my mind, I had suffered through 15 years of irrelevant education to finally get someone to tell me how to be a teacher, and I was not going to waste a drop of that precious information. I remember showing up to my math methods class during that fall semester, and the professor had us all sit in groups. If you're not familiar with this terminology, by the way, the math methods is where they teach you how to teach math. So the professor dumped a container of counters on the table between us, those little red and yellow chips that basically every elementary classroom has now. But I'd never used them before in my life. I was a little nervous, I have to admit, about me, of all people, learning how to teach math, but I felt confident that I had sufficiently mastered K-3 math skills by this point, and as long as we weren't doing anything harder than third grade math, I felt pretty sure I would survive. So the professor began modeling how to teach the math lesson for us, and he gave us instructions on what to do with the counters. He told us, make a group of 3, now make another group of 3. Now make another group of 3. How many do you have? 9, right. So, what number sentence did you just illustrate? Someone in the back of the room called out, 3 times 3 equals 9. And I'm telling you, my jaw almost hit the floor. I looked down at my manipulatives and just stared. 3 groups of 3. Wait, that's multiplication? That's what 3 times 3 means? Multiplication actually means something. My mind was just blown. It wasn't just a set of facts to memorize. I just was shocked. It was like the Hallelujah chorus was playing. Unicorns with rainbow tails were flitting around the room. And then I realized, with panic, that I was 19 years old and just figured out what multiplication was. I felt like such an idiot. I guess they weren't kidding when they told me I had a math learning disability. And then suddenly, the girl to my right said, "Oh, I get it. I never realized this before. These counters are great." And the girl across the table nodded in agreement. She said, I didn't want to say anything, but that's the first time I really got it too. Wow. And the 3 of us just sat there exchanging glances in total disbelief that we'd just now figured out what multiplication actually was. That math methods course changed my life. Or maybe I should say base 10 blocks changed my life. As I learned to trade in 10 ones for a 10 rod and 10 tens for a hundreds block, I realized for the first time what place value and number sense were all about. Multiple digit addition and subtraction made sense beyond this rote process that I'd been taught to memorize. The secret to numbers was unlocked for me. I finally got it. The rest of my journey as a student went by pretty quickly. I got hired right after graduation from college, and I pursued a master's degree beginning in my second year of teaching. There was an awesome program through Western Maryland College, which they now call McDaniel College, and it trained teachers on our school campus instead of making us go to the college campus. And as a result, we were able to do it for a fraction of the regular tuition cost. I don't know how they pulled that off. I don't know what kind of arrangement it is. I've looked into it since then, and they're not doing it anymore. But I can tell you, my master's program in curriculum and instruction was the best teaching I've ever received in my life. Tons of practical experiences and truly useful learning with awesome professors. I think I fell in love just a little bit with this idea of teaching teachers, even way back then, in my second year in the classroom. And it was because of the quality of that program and how much we learned together. I guess it's fair to say that I didn't ever enjoy being a student until I was technically an adult. I don't have a favorite teacher story from when I was growing up. And I don't have a moral to this story. Mine is not a true against the odds kind of story. I came from a solid, functional, middle-class home. And I think there's some inconvenient truths here that make it hard to turn this into something with a neat little bow and a clearly defined message. I suppose the takeaway could be that we need to continue making our schools more student-centered and provide more choice and autonomy for kids. Or maybe it's that we need to teach growth mindset. Kids who learn differently need to know that their intelligence isn't fixed and they can improve even in skills that are difficult for them. And kids who are advanced for their age know that they shouldn't expect everything to come easily to them. So when they suddenly need to work hard on something, they realize that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them, or assume there's no use in trying to improve. But I also want you to use my story as a reminder that you truly never know what a child's future is going to be like. Never make the judgment that a student will not amount to anything or will waste their gifts and talents. That kid in your class who has side conversations all the time and doesn't pay attention to your directions, that kid could have been me. That kid who doesn't try and who thinks they know it all already, that kid could have been me. That kid who skips class and seems totally disinterested in everything you're teaching. The one who's flunking out and doesn't seem like they'll ever amount to anything. That kid could have been me too. If you had told any of my high school teachers that I would one day be a teacher myself and then teach other teachers and then create a business where I'm running a podcast and publishing books and speaking all across the country about, of all things, my passion for supporting teachers, I think they would fall out of their chairs with laughter. It's actually pretty hilarious if you stop to think about it. Even my elementary teachers would be amazed that the girl who hated math would one day find it was her favorite subject to teach her own students, and that she'd get the math-phobic kids in her class to love it too. And she'd even become a math coach at one point to help other teachers have those same aha moments about constructing mathematical knowledge. So when you think about those kids in your classroom, or maybe it's the kids in your own home, someone listening to this has a child of their own that they're super worried about. And a lot of what I said in my story reminds you of your own child. When you think about those kids who don't learn like the others, who don't think like them, those kids you don't really understand, the kids who don't seem super motivated, who just don't seem to care, and you have no clue what to do with them. Don't give up on those kids. Don't assume that they won't amount to anything. You are planting seeds that will take years to grow, and you probably won't get to see the harvest. You don't know what kind of harvest it's going to be. Remember when I told you that we took that field trip to the Lincoln Theater in high school to see A Raisin in the Sun? That sparked a profound love of history and passion for what we would later come to call social justice that's been there ever since I was 16 years old. I still have every book by Nikki Giovanni sitting on my bookshelf today. And I promise you, my teachers have no idea about that. Knowing myself at that age, I was probably sullen and petulant on that field trip, or super distracted by my friends. But I got exactly what I was supposed to get from that learning experience. It changed me, even though there was no outward evidence of that at the time. Stick with your out-of-the-box students. Stick with the kids who hate school. There could be one thing you do that seems minor, but is actually a pivotal experience for that child. You might know about it instantly, or later, or never. Keep planting those seeds. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.